Vanakkam. Welcome to this course on classics in neuroscience. In this series of videos, we have been looking at classic Nobel Prize winning works. In this particular series, we are looking at the classic Nobel Prize winning works of Charles Sherrington. In this video, we will look at Sherrington's quiet mind experiment, the brain at rest, and Sherrington's early descriptions of neuroplasticity without actually coining the term neuroplasticity, and Sherrington's work on central pattern generators and animal locomotion. Sherrington performed the quiet mind experiment or studied the brain at rest. Sherrington was one of the first scientists to suggest that the brain is never truly at rest. So, when you say that the brain is at rest, you are essentially suggesting that the entire brain is at rest or all the neurons in the brain are at rest. That is what you are suggesting. Sherrington suggested about 125 years ago that this is almost never the case. The entire brain is never truly at rest. If the entire brain is at rest, perhaps the person is not alive or the organism is not alive. So, in live animals, even if they are sleeping, there are some neurons that are active. This was the suggestion that Sherrington proposed. He supported this idea by performing electrophysiological experiments on animals and found that neurons remain active even without any form of external stimuli. You do not need any form of haptic stimuli, visual stimuli, olfactory stimuli, taste stimuli, no stimulus is needed. Even at rest, even when the animal is completely at rest, some neurons are still active. This suggested that there are these resting state networks that are now extensively studied using functional MRI to have the resolution that you need to study which are those networks that are working when the organism is at rest now. Why is this important? Well, essentially this contradicts the idea that neurons are active only when they are activated by some stimulus, otherwise they are sleeping. This is not true. Even when there is no stimulus, neurons may be spontaneously active. This is what was suggested. Sherrington actually laid the foundation for modern research in fields that is now very hot, that involve studies of executive function, attention and other such things, where he described, where now we describe and discuss default mode networks, the brain activity pattern that is linked to daydreaming, creativity, self-reflection, all these things that are now being studied. Sherrington did not discuss these things. However, Sherrington's early suggestion that neurons are never completely at rest essentially was a extraordinary suggestion for the age at which it was made. To make this suggestion in the early 1900s or the late 1890s was truly brilliant. Of course, he did not just make this suggestion, he also had experimental or electrophysiological evidence to make this suggestion. Based on that, he made this suggestion, but now this is a well known and well accepted idea that there are these networks, resting state networks and default mode networks that are active even when the system is not stimulated somehow. Also, Sherrington practically pioneered some of the early concepts of neuroplasticity, although this was suggested by other scientists like Cahal, but it was Sherrington who provided some experimental evidence to support this idea. Although Sherrington himself did not directly coin the term neuroplasticity, it is a term that was coined later, but his work essentially alluded Alluded means pointed or indirectly hinted. Okay. Alluded means hinted. Okay. Decades before this idea, many decades before the idea of neuroplasticity ever became mainstream, what was the evidence that he suggested? He essentially provided the evidence that synapses strengthen or weaken depending on whether and when and how they are used. Depending on the use of synapses, the nature of synapses may change, essentially suggesting that synapses can strengthen or weaken over a period of time depending on their use, the nature of their use now, suggesting that there is this concept of synaptic strength. Now, there are these well known and well accepted concepts of LTP and LTD. What are these? LTP and LTD, what are these? Long term potentiation and long term depression. So, potentiation means strengthening, depression means weakening. He also provided evidence to suggest that neurons that are injured can sometimes adapt by rerouting signals through other neurons. This is essentially neuroplasticity. This is the principle that we now use in treatment of diseases like stroke. The current approach, mainstream approach to treat stroke is the neuroplasticity based approach to neurorehabilitation. So, this was revolutionary in the age in which it was proposed. This was essentially a crude early version of Hebbian learning, that is neurons that fire together, wire together, which is the foundation of modern neuroscience, modern cognitive neuroscience and AI based learning models. All these things essentially use this idea that you can strengthen the neurons depending on how frequently, how often do you use, how are they used, for what purpose they are used. All these things essentially determine how strong the connections become or how weak the connections become. So, the connections between neurons can become weaker than the beginning, than the initial use, for example. These insights essentially contributed to the neuroplasticity based neurorehabilitation approaches that are currently used in treatment of stroke and some other neuromotor disorders. This is essentially the ability of the brain to rewire itself upon injury. This is something that we hugely depend on for therapy of diseases like stroke. He also performed experiments on animals suggesting the existence of spinal pattern generators. He studied how spinal cord controls rhythmic movement or oscillatory movements similar to walking. Not just walking, there are several rhythmic oscillatory movements performed by animals. He discovered that there are these oscillatory circuits that are called central pattern generators in the spinal cord that produce rhythmic movements without needing any higher level or cortical or brain level inputs. So, suggesting that these rhythmic movements may be controlled almost entirely by the spinal cord without any brain input. Of course, the parameters of the rhythms, and if you would like to change the rhythm at some point, then the brain will need to intervene. But the programming of one rhythm itself was perhaps a function that was localized to the spinal cord itself. And he showed that even in decerebrate animals in which there was sufficient brain damage, or animals in which he experimentally transected the cortex, cerebral cortex, he found that even these animals could still walk and do so in a coordinated manner due to the presence of these spinal pattern generators or central pattern generators. Why is this important? Because it essentially suggested how spinal cord injuries can affect movement and what steps can be taken to restore function, lost function, and essentially provided inspiration for building of robotic exoskeletons that are still being studied. It is a hot area of research, and how to provide therapy to people with spinal cord injury. With this, we come to the end of this video. In this video, we looked at 3 of major contributions by Sherrington. His quiet mind experiment suggesting that the brain is never fully at rest. There are always some neurons that are active, and Sherrington's early descriptions of neuroplasticity, without actually coining the term, that the connections between neurons may strengthen or weaken over a period of time, and the nature of its use, and Sherrington's use and Sherrington's studies in animals, in which he demonstrated the existence of spinal pattern generators or central pattern generators that perhaps formed critical components that led to rhythmic movements or locomotion or locomotor like movements in animals. Thank you very much for your attention.